Some truths are impossible to ignore, no matter how carefully you try to hide from them. The morning sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Manhattan's Sterling Medical Center, scattering golden patterns across the polished marble floors and reflecting off the chrome fixtures with a soft brilliance that seemed almost unreal. Richard Carter adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit, the weight of his gold watch catching the light as he glanced at the neatly stacked folders on the reception desk, each one a reminder of the meticulous life he had built, successful, controlled, and meticulously planned. Today was a routine checkup, or at least it should have been, yet a tension hung in the air, subtle and insistent, like a whisper from some invisible hand. As he followed the nurse down the gleaming hallway, the soft hum of the ventilation mingling with the faint scent of antiseptic, his mind wandered, replaying old memories, decisions made and paths not taken, until they arrived at the examination room. That's when he saw her. Emily Johnson, in her white coat, with a stethoscope resting around her neck, the same Emily he had once loved, the same Emily whose laughter had once echoed through his penthouse on a night when the city lights had felt like theirs alone. Time seemed to freeze for a moment, the clinical brightness of the room fading as his heart, so long trained to stay measured, betrayed him with a rush of disbelief. Her eyes, calm and focused, lifted to meet his, and for a heartbeat, everything else disappeared. The ticking of the clock, the antiseptic smell, the soft rustle of paperwork, replaced by the echo of a past that refused to stay buried. He noticed a small figure near the corner, a little girl with tight curls and wide eyes, engrossed in a coloring book, who looked inexplicably like him, as though some fragment of himself had been sketched into existence without his consent. His mouth opened, and no words came, caught in the taut line between recognition and denial. Emily offered a polite, professional smile, unaware of the storm her presence had stirred, and gestured toward the examination chair with practiced ease. But Richard could not move, caught in a whirl of questions, emotions, and possibilities that raced faster than his rational mind could follow. The child's laughter, light and innocent, rippled through the room, and something deep inside him stirred, a mixture of wonder, fear, and longing that he could not name, yet knew was irrevocable. He finally drew a breath, steadying himself, and forced his eyes to meet Emily's again, the recognition dawning slowly, painfully, and with a gravity that made the bright, clinical room feel like the stage of an unspoken revelation. Every instinct he had cultivated for control, every lesson in poise and precision, faltered as he glimpsed the undeniable truth that the past had returned not as a memory, but as a living, breathing testament to the choices, love, and secrets that had shaped both of their lives. The soft light caught the edges of Emily's features, the curve of her jaw, the strength in her posture, and he realized that the woman before him was both familiar and unknowable, a keeper of a past that had silently endured, and the little girl, with her wide, curious eyes, was a tangible piece of that hidden world, a living thread connecting him to a destiny he had never anticipated. And in that suspended, breathless moment, Richard Carter understood that nothing in his carefully constructed life would ever be the same again. Richard Carter's hand hovered over the examination chair as he tried to steady the rapid pulse that he could feel thrumming against his ribcage. Emily Johnson moved with practiced efficiency, checking the chart and making notes, unaware of the storm that had quietly overtaken the man before her. The little girl, named Sophie, traced the patterns on the floor tiles with her fingers, her innocent focus creating a sharp contrast to the tension in Richard's mind. He took a slow, deliberate breath and let his eyes wander around the room, noticing the small details he had never paid attention to before, the faint scent of lavender from the hand sanitizer dispenser, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, and the sunlight filtering through the blinds that created stripes across the sleek medical instruments. Richard's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying every conversation, every moment he had shared with Emily in the past, trying to piece together how this convergence of time and destiny had brought them together again. He found himself studying Emily's expression, the subtle arch of her brow, the gentle curve of her lips, and the calm precision with which she moved. There was a quiet strength there, an unwavering focus that had not changed since the last time he had truly seen her, and it made him feel simultaneously connected and alien. He wanted to speak, to break the silence that seemed to stretch like a living entity between them, but the words caught in his throat, heavy with the weight of the unspoken past. Sophie, oblivious to the complex emotions at play, turned suddenly and smiled up at him, her wide eyes sparkling with curiosity and recognition that went beyond her years. Richard felt an unfamiliar warmth rising in his chest, a tug of affection and protectiveness that he could not ignore. It was as if the presence of this child had bridged a gap he had not realized existed, connecting him not just to Emily, but to a chapter of life he had not anticipated. He finally found his voice, his tone steady but soft. "She is beautiful," he said, his gaze lingering on Sophie's small hands, the way they held the crayon, and the attentive posture she had learned from Emily. Emily looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his, a flicker of recognition passing between them, though her professional mask remained intact. "Thank you," she replied quietly, her voice measured, yet carrying a subtle warmth that had been absent from their past encounters. The air in the room seemed to shift, heavy with unspoken truths and possibilities that had yet to be explored. Richard's mind raced with questions he did not yet know how to ask, questions about the child, about the years that had passed, about the choices that had brought them all here. He stepped closer, carefully maintaining the space that respect and propriety demanded, yet feeling an irresistible pull toward understanding, toward clarity, toward the answers that lay hidden behind Emily's composed exterior. Sophie reached out to him, holding up a small, brightly colored drawing, a simple depiction of a family with two adults and a child holding hands, and Richard's breath caught at the innocence and prescience captured in those childish lines. Emily's eyes softened ever so slightly, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile as she acknowledged the connection without speaking it aloud. Richard felt the weight of the moment, the delicate balance between past regrets and future possibilities, and realized that this encounter, this seemingly ordinary checkup, was anything but ordinary. It was the beginning of a reckoning, a revelation, and perhaps the first step toward a reconciliation with both his heart and the unexpected miracle standing before him in the form of a child who looked like a living reflection of himself. The sun had shifted in the sky, casting a warmer light across the room, and with each passing second, Richard's resolve hardened, not as a man trying to control everything, but as someone ready to face the truths that destiny had placed directly in his path, to understand Emily, to acknowledge Sophie, and to navigate the delicate intersection of past, present, and what might yet come. Every detail, from the gentle rhythm of Sophie's movements to the calm authority in Emily's voice, etched itself into Richard's consciousness, creating a tapestry of sights, sounds, and emotions that he would not soon forget, a sensory map of a moment in time that held within it the potential to change everything he had once thought immutable. Richard Carter finally pulled a chair to sit across from Emily Johnson, his hands resting lightly on his knees as he struggled to organize the torrent of thoughts that had overtaken him since entering the room. The subtle scent of her lavender hand sanitizer seemed to calm him slightly, a small, grounding detail amidst the chaos of emotions swirling within. Sophie, still clutching her coloring book, glanced up at Richard with a quiet curiosity, her innocent eyes shining with an unspoken question that pierced through his carefully constructed composure. Emily flipped a page on her tablet, her movements precise, confident, and entirely at ease, though Richard sensed the undercurrent of memories behind her calm demeanor. He took a slow breath, allowing himself to observe her without interruption, noting the slight crease of her forehead when concentrating, the way her dark hair caught the sunlight streaming through the blinds, and the steady rhythm of her breathing that suggested control and resilience. Richard's mind wandered to the years that had passed, the missed conversations, the silences that had grown between them, and he realized that the little girl before him, Sophie, was not just a child but a living testament to those years, a bridge between what had been and what could still be. He spoke carefully, choosing words with deliberate calm. "She seems very attentive," and Emily glanced up, her expression a mixture of professional courtesy and recognition. "She has been curious about everything since she could walk," she replied softly, her tone steady, yet carrying a warmth that had not been present in their past interactions. The child offered a small drawing to Richard, a simple sketch of three figures holding hands, and he felt an almost magnetic pull to lean forward, to acknowledge it, to connect with what had been quietly awaiting him for so long. Emily observed silently, her gaze briefly softening as if she had sensed the realization forming in his mind, the connection he had begun to make between the child, her, and the years that separated them. Richard allowed himself to take a measured step closer, keeping a respectful distance, yet feeling an inexorable draw toward understanding, toward bridging the gap that life and circumstance had placed between them. The room, filled with the faint hum of medical equipment and filtered sunlight, seemed to shrink, concentrating all attention on the three of them, and in that shared space, a fragile understanding began to form, subtle and unspoken. He found himself thinking of the choices that had led to this moment, of the unexpected twists of fate that had brought them together, and of the responsibility and opportunity that now rested before him. Emily continued her work with quiet efficiency, yet the air between them was charged with the unspoken, the possibility of reconciling past regrets with present realities, and Richard felt a new clarity emerging, an awareness that the path ahead would require patience, honesty, and openness. He bent slightly to accept Sophie's drawing, the warmth of the child's small hand in his own sending a current of emotion through him that was both startling and grounding. Emily watched, her composure unwavering, yet her eyes betrayed the acknowledgement of the significance of this gesture, the beginning of a bridge being formed, a connection slowly knitting together across years of distance and silence. Richard's gaze lingered on Sophie for a moment longer before lifting to Emily, and in that gaze, a silent communication passed between them, recognition of the past, acknowledgement of the present, and the tentative hope for a future that they had not dared to imagine until this very moment. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting golden light across the room and illuminating the small, simple acts that were quietly redefining their relationship, and Richard felt the weight of the moment, the convergence of past, present, and future, pressing upon him with a clarity that was both humbling and exhilarating, signaling the first steps toward understanding, acceptance, and the formation of a family that had been waiting in the wings of fate. Richard Carter remained seated, his eyes quietly following Sophie as she carefully set down her crayons and stood to approach him, her small hands reaching up as if inviting him into a world he had only glimpsed from a distance. Emily Johnson moved with a grace that combined both authority and warmth, adjusting the medical equipment while keeping a careful eye on both Richard and the child, her presence a steady anchor amidst the swirling emotions. The room was filled with a delicate balance of sounds, the soft shuffle of papers, the faint hum of the ventilation, the rhythmic tapping of Richard's polished shoes against the marble floor, and the occasional murmur from Sophie as she chattered about the colors in her drawing. Richard leaned forward slightly, allowing himself to smile, a small, tentative gesture, and felt a surprising sense of ease settle over him, as if acknowledging the child had begun to dissolve the tension that had built up in the preceding minutes. Emily paused, looking up from her tablet, and for a brief moment, her professional mask faltered, allowing a glimpse of the woman who had once held his heart. "She is remarkably observant," Richard said, his voice calm, yet carrying a depth that suggested both awe and the weight of realization. Emily met his gaze steadily, her expression composed yet softening in a subtle acknowledgement. "Curiosity has always been her strength, much like her mother," she replied, a faint smile curving her lips, carrying an undercurrent of unspoken history. Richard's mind raced, tracing the similarities between the child's gestures, the way she tilted her head when concentrating, the slight curl of her lips when amused, and memories of Emily from years past, creating a tapestry of recognition that left him both stunned and profoundly moved. Sophie giggled lightly, running to show a small toy to Richard, and the innocence of her laughter seemed to fill the room with warmth, drawing a ripple of emotion that he had not expected to feel so intensely. He reached out gently, allowing the child to place the toy in his hand, and felt a connection that was both immediate and undeniable, a tangible thread tying him to the past and hinting at the possibilities of the future. Emily adjusted a monitor, her movements deliberate and precise. Yet she cast a quick glance toward Richard, her eyes reflecting a quiet acknowledgement of the delicate unfolding of the moment, the silent understanding that something significant was beginning to take shape between them. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, creating stripes of golden light across the room, illuminating the subtle details. The glint in Richard's eye as he watched Sophie, the faint tension in Emily's shoulders softening, the way the child's small movements commanded attention without words. Richard allowed himself a slow, deliberate breath, noticing how the simple presence of Sophie and the composed strength of Emily had altered the atmosphere, shifting it from uncertainty to tentative hope. He felt a sense of responsibility settling over him, a recognition that this encounter was not merely chance, but a pivotal moment demanding careful attention, compassion, and thoughtfulness. Emily returned her focus to her work, maintaining professional composure, yet her eyes flicked to Richard with a quiet reassurance, a signal that while the past had its shadows, the present offered clarity and possibility. Richard observed, listened, and allowed himself to internalize the gravity of the situation, realizing that the delicate interplay of past, present, and potential future required patience, empathy, and a willingness to embrace what destiny had orchestrated. The soft golden light of the morning seemed to linger, accentuating the subtle connections forming in the room, and Richard felt the first true stirrings of resolve, a recognition that understanding, acceptance, and a willingness to step forward with care and attention were the first essential steps toward bridging the distance that time had imposed, and perhaps toward a future where the three of them could navigate the unfolding story together, anchored in recognition, trust, and the promise of shared discovery. The quiet hum of the medical instruments filled the room as Richard Carter remained seated, absorbing the unfolding reality with a mixture of awe and tentative curiosity. Emily Johnson moved with fluid precision, checking Sophie's vitals with a careful, steady hand, and each motion seemed to reinforce her composure. The professionalism that had always set her apart now intertwined with a personal history that he could no longer ignore. Richard's eyes followed every movement, noticing the subtle way Emily's expression softened when Sophie smiled, the quiet pride in her posture as she guided the child's small hands during a simple task, and the rhythmic calm of her voice as she offered gentle instructions. Sophie, energetic yet focused, glanced at Richard, a sparkle in her eyes that seemed to ask questions he was not ready to voice, yet compelled him to answer within his own thoughts, connecting instinctively to a paternal awareness that had awakened quietly within him. The sunlight streaming through the blinds cast warm stripes across the polished floor, illuminating the delicate details, the fine weave of Emily's coat, the glint of the child's bracelet, the way the light danced across Richard's watch, and in that illumination, he felt the weight of time, the accumulation of years, choices, and missed opportunities that had led to this precise, inevitable intersection of their lives. He reached out slowly, careful not to startle Sophie, and she held out a small, colorful toy with the unself-conscious generosity of a child, bridging the gap between the past he had left behind and the present he could no longer avoid. Emily's gaze met his for a fleeting moment, acknowledgement passing between them silently, the unspoken understanding that this was no longer simply a professional encounter, but a delicate negotiation of history, trust, and possibility. Richard allowed himself to breathe deeply, letting the rhythm of the room, the soft footsteps, the muted conversation of the nurse in the background, the quiet laughter of Sophie, settle him into a moment of clarity. He thought of the years that had passed, the decisions that had shaped their lives, and realized that the child before him was a living testament to those years, a tangible connection that could not be ignored. The room seemed to contract, focusing all attention on the three of them, yet in the intimacy of the shared space, there was no tension, only the slow unfolding of understanding and recognition. Richard's hand moved to offer a gentle pat on Sophie's head, an action that felt both instinctual and significant, and the child responded with a shy but genuine smile that brightened the room in a way that Richard had not anticipated. Emily continued her work, maintaining a calm professionalism, but there was a subtle softness in her demeanor, an acknowledgement of the importance of the moment and the beginning of a bridge being formed, one careful step at a time. Richard felt a quiet resolve growing within him, a recognition that this encounter required patience, openness, and a willingness to navigate the delicate balance between past regrets and future possibilities. The golden light of the morning seemed to linger, bathing the room in warmth, highlighting the small, meaningful gestures and emphasizing the silent communication between them, a conversation held in glances, small movements, and shared understanding rather than words. Richard understood that this was the first step toward a new chapter, one in which he would need to embrace the complexities of connection, responsibility, and possibility, and in that awareness, he felt the faint, stirring promise of reconciliation, of understanding, and perhaps the gentle beginnings of a family yet to be fully realized. Richard Carter finally rose from the chair, the polished marble floor reflecting the morning light as it filtered through the blinds, casting long stripes across the room that seemed to mark the passage of time in golden bands. Sophie followed him with small, careful steps, her eyes bright with curiosity and a quiet excitement, clutching her coloring book as if it were a talisman bridging the distance between her world and his. Emily Johnson remained at her station, observing the subtle interactions, her expression calm, yet softened by the awareness of the unspoken connection forming between the three of them. Richard took a deliberate step closer to the child, allowing the warmth of the room and the gentle energy of Sophie's presence to ground him in a way he had not expected. "Do you like to draw?" he asked, his voice steady yet carrying a hint of wonder that betrayed the depth of his growing fascination. Sophie nodded enthusiastically, holding up a small page filled with colorful shapes and lines that depicted a sunny day, a house, and three figures holding hands, their simplicity infused with the sincerity of her perspective. Richard studied the drawing with careful attention, noting the resemblance between one of the figures and himself, a subtle mirror of features and posture that sent a wave of recognition and emotion through him. Emily approached, her movements composed and deliberate. "She enjoys capturing what she sees in her world," she said softly, her eyes briefly meeting his with a glance that spoke of trust, understanding, and the acknowledgement of shared history without words. The sunlight shifted, bathing the room in a warm glow that highlighted the subtle gestures, the curl of Sophie's fingers around the crayon, the slight incline of her head as she watched. Richard, the soft focus in Emily's eyes as she observed the quiet interplay. Richard extended a hand toward Sophie, inviting her to come closer, and she responded with the ease of a child accustomed to trust, placing the page gently in his palm and smiling up at him with the innocence of unfiltered emotion. He felt an unfamiliar sense of connection, a bridge forming between past and present, one that held the potential to shape the future in ways he had not anticipated. Emily returned to her instruments, her actions fluid and purposeful, yet she maintained her gaze on Richard and Sophie, the warmth in her eyes a quiet acknowledgement of the growing bond and the delicate unfolding of understanding. Richard allowed himself a deep, measured breath, noticing how each small interaction, each soft sound and movement, seemed to weave them closer together, binding him to the child and to Emily in a tapestry of potential and hope. He looked down at Sophie, her eyes bright and unguarded, and he realized that this encounter was not just about rediscovery, but about the possibility of creating something enduring, a family formed not merely by circumstance, but by recognition, care, and intention. The morning light highlighted the subtle expressions, the glances exchanged, and the gentle gestures that spoke louder than words, and Richard felt the quiet stirrings of purpose and resolve, a determination to navigate the complexity of the situation with thoughtfulness, openness, and a willingness to embrace the unfolding possibilities. Emily continued her work with calm precision, yet the ease in her posture suggested she, too, sensed the transformative weight of the moment, the awareness that the interactions in this room were the beginning of a new chapter, one marked by trust, understanding, and the tentative formation of a connection that had waited silently for the right time to emerge. Richard's gaze lingered on Sophie as she skipped slightly in place, then turned back to Emily with a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes, and in that simple, unspoken exchange, the three of them shared a fragile, luminous sense of the beginning of a journey that held the promise of reconciliation, discovery, and the quiet creation of a family tethered not by circumstance alone, but by the bonds of recognition, care, and the gentle unfolding of destiny. Richard Carter remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the quiet rhythm of the room to settle around him as if the soft hum of the ventilation and the filtered sunlight were orchestrating a gentle cadence for reflection. Sophie, ever curious and unrestrained by adult caution, approached the edge of the examination chair and looked up at Richard with wide, trusting eyes that seemed to silently request attention, guidance, and recognition all at once. He bent slightly, maintaining the careful distance required by propriety, yet extending a hand that was both tentative and deliberate, and Sophie responded immediately, her small fingers wrapping around his in a gesture that was instinctively warm and unassuming. Emily Johnson adjusted the stethoscope around her neck and glanced at Richard, her expression calm and steady, yet subtly revealing the awareness of the significance of this interaction, the quiet acknowledgement that this moment was a turning point beyond the routine of her professional duties. Richard allowed himself a measured exhale, feeling the weight of the years, the distance, and the complexities of the past gently settle into the awareness of the present, a consciousness that was both sobering and full of unexpected hope. The little girl released his hand to return to her drawing, laying down a new page filled with colorful shapes, a house, and 3 figures standing close together, their simple forms conveying a narrative of connection, safety, and belonging that resonated deeply within him. Richard studied the drawing, noting the intentional placement of each figure, the thoughtful strokes of color, and the subtle mirroring of his own features in one of the figures, which stirred a current of recognition and a mixture of wonder and responsibility that he had not anticipated. Emily moved closer, her movements fluid and composed, gently guiding Sophie as she held up the drawing, her voice soft yet confident. "She likes to express her understanding of the world through her art," she explained, her eyes briefly meeting Richard's with a nuanced glance that communicated the layers of history, trust, and the silent acknowledgement of the growing bond between them. Richard's gaze softened as he considered the passage of time, the choices made and paths left unexplored, and he recognized that Sophie's innocence and insight were catalysts for a connection that had been quietly awaiting this convergence. The sunlight shifted slightly, brushing golden light across the polished surfaces, illuminating the small, significant gestures, the curve of Sophie's smile, the attentiveness in her eyes, the subtle reassurance in Emily's posture that formed a tapestry of quiet meaning. Richard felt a stirring of clarity and purpose, a recognition that the unfolding interactions required him to engage with patience, attentiveness, and sincerity, and that the first steps toward understanding and connection were being taken not through words alone, but through shared presence and attentive observation. Emily returned her attention to the instruments with calm professionalism, yet the slight warmth in her expression suggested she was conscious of the delicate and evolving narrative in the room, a story of rediscovery, recognition, and the tentative weaving together of past, present, and the potential for future trust. Richard looked down at Sophie once more, observing her unself-conscious movements, her engagement with both her surroundings and him, and felt an emerging sense of responsibility, commitment, and opportunity that had not been present when he first entered the room. The soft ambient sounds, the filtered sunlight, the subtle interplay of glances, gestures, and attentiveness between the 3 of them created a quiet, luminous energy, one that suggested the beginnings of reconciliation, understanding, and the careful formation of a bond that could shape the trajectory of their lives in a way both profound and enduring. Each moment, no matter how small, was layered with significance, and Richard understood that navigating this newfound awareness with sensitivity, thoughtfulness, and openness was the key to moving forward, creating a path toward connection, trust, and a shared journey that had quietly awaited their presence. Richard Carter stood by the large window, the sunlight casting a warm glow across the polished floors of the examination room as he took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the gravity of the morning settle around him. Sophie's small hand slipped into his once again, her fingers curling with innocent familiarity, and he felt a profound sense of connection stir within him, a mixture of awe, protectiveness, and the quiet recognition of responsibility that came with seeing the child who bore unmistakable traces of both their shared past and his own features. Emily Johnson adjusted the charts on the counter, her movements precise and unhurried. Yet she cast the occasional glance toward Richard and Sophie, an unspoken understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement that what was happening in this room went beyond routine medical practice. The child, noticing the soft energy between the adults, tugged gently at Richard's hand and pointed toward a small set of blocks on the floor, her expression expectant, prompting him to kneel slowly and engage with her in the simple act of play, the ordinary activity infused with extraordinary significance. As he guided Sophie's hands to stack the blocks, arranging them into towers that wobbled and then steadied under careful adjustment, Richard's mind traced the years of absence, the gaps in experience, and the unexpected ways fate had brought them together again in a room filled with sunlight, quiet sounds, and the gentle rhythm of breathing, laughter, and movement. Emily observed quietly, her eyes softening as she saw the interaction, recognizing in it the tentative formation of trust, connection, and shared understanding, a bridge being built slowly, intentionally, with every gesture, glance, and pause. Richard paused, looking down at Sophie's bright eyes, and felt an unanticipated surge of clarity, the realization that patience, presence, and attentiveness were the true measures of his role in this new chapter of their lives. He encouraged Sophie to place the blocks carefully atop one another, celebrating the small victories, the moments of balance, and the simple achievements that carried profound symbolic weight, reflecting the delicate and careful steps required to rebuild connections, trust, and relationships fractured by time and distance. Emily stepped closer to join them in the activity, her presence adding quiet support, and together, the three of them navigated a shared space of learning, laughter, and gentle cooperation, the sunlight shifting across the room as it illuminated the subtle expressions of curiosity, warmth, and understanding that flowed between them. Richard felt the weight of gratitude settle in his chest, a calm but powerful sense of purpose emerging, as he recognized that the ordinary acts of engagement, attention, and care were the foundations for the extraordinary potential that lay ahead. Sophie, delighted by the collaborative effort, giggled and clapped her hands, and the sound, light and unguarded, seemed to echo softly off the walls, embedding a sense of warmth and possibility into the moment. Richard allowed a quiet smile to cross his face, the first of the morning, as he looked at both Emily and Sophie, sensing in the gentle unfolding of their interactions the possibility of understanding, connection, and the careful weaving together of past, present, and future into a fabric that could support trust, recognition, and an emerging sense of family. The filtered sunlight highlighted the small gestures, the tilt of a head, the placement of a hand, the slight softening of eyes, that together created a tapestry of meaning, subtly signaling the first steps toward reconciliation, emotional closeness, and the realization that the moments of attentiveness, patience, and presence were not only shaping the present, but laying the foundation for a future where trust, understanding, and quiet joy could flourish. The afternoon sunlight shifted gently through the tall windows, casting elongated patterns across the floor and illuminating the quiet determination etched into Richard Carter's face. He knelt beside Sophie, observing the way she carefully arranged her blocks into intricate shapes, each movement deliberate yet infused with the carefree spirit of a child who had spent years learning from her surroundings. Emily Johnson moved gracefully around them, checking charts and taking notes, her attention divided between professional duties and the subtle, unfolding dynamic between Richard and Sophie, aware of the delicate balance of emotions that hovered in the room. Richard reached out, guiding Sophie's hands with soft, measured movements, showing her how to stack the blocks without tipping them. And in those moments, he felt a deepening awareness of his responsibility, a sense of paternal connection that had been dormant until now. The child's laughter, light and uninhibited, filled the room, blending with the quiet hum of the ventilation and the soft rustle of papers on the counter, creating a soundtrack of calm and possibility. Emily paused briefly, watching the interaction with quiet appreciation, her eyes reflecting the recognition that this was more than a simple play session. It was the slow, careful weaving of trust, and the tentative forming of bonds that could endure. Richard allowed himself to relax slightly, his shoulders easing from their habitual tension, as he realized the power of presence, attentiveness, and patience, and the importance of participating fully in this shared moment. He encouraged Sophie gently, praising her precision as the blocks stood firm, and she beamed with pride, her small hands clapping in delight, the simple gesture resonating with a profound sense of accomplishment that reached far beyond the playroom floor. Emily joined in, kneeling beside Richard and Sophie for a brief instant, guiding Sophie's hands, and the three of them shared a quiet, harmonious interaction, each aware of the subtle messages communicated through gestures, glances, and shared laughter. Richard's gaze lifted to Emily, and he noted the subtle warmth in her eyes, the quiet reassurance in her expression that acknowledged both his care for Sophie and the careful attention he was bringing to the present. The sunlight shifted again, brushing across the room, highlighting the small details, the shine of Sophie's hair, the crisp lines of Emily's coat, the soft reflections on the polished floor, and Richard felt a profound sense of clarity, the understanding that the simple, deliberate acts of attention, guidance, and engagement were the foundation upon which trust, understanding, and connection could be rebuilt. He adjusted his position slightly, ensuring that Sophie remained comfortable while continuing to engage her with encouragement and guidance. And he sensed the gradual formation of an emotional bridge, a pathway of recognition, care, and possibility linking the three of them. Emily continued her work while observing, her posture and expression a combination of professionalism and subtle warmth, signaling that the unfolding interactions were significant, shaping not just the present moment, but the potential for future closeness, understanding, and shared experiences. Richard felt the weight of awareness, recognizing that every small gesture, every patient explanation, every moment of gentle attention contributed to a foundation that could sustain connection, trust, and mutual respect over time. Sophie leaned slightly against him, her trust evident in the way she sought his guidance, and Richard responded with deliberate, steady encouragement, acknowledging both the child's independence and her need for support. And in that quiet interplay, a sense of harmony and tentative stability began to emerge, signaling the gradual but undeniable formation of a family dynamic grounded in attentiveness, care, and the careful cultivation of emotional connection. The late afternoon sunlight shifted through the tall windows, casting long, warm stripes across the polished marble of the examination room, as Richard Carter stood back slightly, observing the subtle rhythms of interaction between Emily Johnson and Sophie. The child was engrossed in a new drawing, her small hands moving with both focus and joy, while Emily guided her gently, offering quiet encouragement and careful instruction. Richard's gaze lingered on the scene, noting the way Sophie's eyes sparkled with curiosity, the tilt of her head as she considered her colors, and the way her tiny hands moved with the precision and care that mirrored the patience of her mother. He felt a profound mixture of admiration and realization, recognizing that this was not just a moment of simple play or instruction, but a formative, binding experience, quietly knitting them together in ways that words could not capture. Emily paused for a moment, her expression calm and thoughtful as she watched both Richard and Sophie, a subtle softening in her posture that spoke to the awareness of the significance of the unfolding interactions. Richard knelt to the child's level, offering gentle guidance and playful suggestions that prompted Sophie to experiment with new shapes and colors. Each successful placement of a block or stroke of a crayon met with delight and small, genuine laughter that seemed to fill the room with warmth. The sunlight caught the edges of Richard's features, highlighting the careful attention in his eyes and the slow, deliberate movements of his hands as he participated fully in the activity, allowing himself to be present in the moment without distraction. Emily returned to her notes and instruments with calm professionalism, yet she glanced at Richard occasionally, acknowledging silently the emerging bond and the delicate progression of trust, understanding, and mutual recognition between him and the child. Richard felt a stirring of clarity, an awareness that the simplest acts of attention and care were powerful in creating connection, and he allowed himself to remain fully present, noting the quiet cues of emotion and reaction that guided his interaction. Sophie turned suddenly to show a detail in her drawing, her small voice enthusiastic and filled with pride, and Richard leaned closer, listening intently, offering gentle praise and encouragement, his tone steady yet warm, acknowledging the child's efforts and insight. Emily's eyes softened, and she took a step closer, participating briefly in the shared activity, guiding Sophie's hand with a light touch and a nod, creating a quiet triangle of interaction where attention, care, and recognition flowed naturally among the three of them. The room felt imbued with a gentle energy, the filtered sunlight shifting across the surfaces and illuminating the small gestures, the tilt of a head, the careful placement of a block, the fleeting smile that passed between child and adult, each carrying meaning and reinforcing the subtle, unspoken connections forming. Richard felt a deepening sense of responsibility, awareness, and the quiet satisfaction of engagement, realizing that presence, patience, and attentive care were laying the foundation for trust and understanding that could grow and endure over time. Sophie's laughter, light and unrestrained, echoed softly across the polished floors, blending with the quiet sounds of the instruments and the subdued movement of Emily, creating a rhythm of life and possibility. Richard observed, participated, and internalized the weight of the moment, understanding that the deliberate acts of connection, guidance, and acknowledgement were shaping a narrative of family, recognition, and the careful formation of bonds that extended beyond words, reaching into shared presence, attention, and the unfolding promise of a new chapter for all three of them. The golden light of late afternoon deepened, casting a soft, warm glow across the polished floor of the examination room as Richard Carter sat back slightly, allowing himself a moment to absorb the full weight of the unfolding reality. Sophie leaned against him, her small hand still tucked securely into his, and Richard felt a wave of recognition and responsibility that he could no longer ignore, a quiet awareness that his presence carried meaning far beyond mere observation. Emily Johnson moved around them with calm precision, her attention split between monitoring the instruments and watching the subtle dynamics of interaction, her eyes softening ever so slightly as she observed the growing connection between father and child. Richard encouraged Sophie to place another colored block atop the carefully constructed tower, and she paused, concentrating with her tiny brows furrowed in determination, then released a delighted laugh when the block remained steady, causing Richard's chest to swell with a mixture of pride, wonder, and the awakening of paternal instinct. Emily guided Sophie's small hands with gentle care, demonstrating without words the patience and attentiveness required to achieve balance. And in that quiet, deliberate exchange, Richard felt the subtle power of teaching, nurturing, and being present. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating the details, the soft glint of Sophie's bracelet, the shine of her hair as it caught the light, the careful alignment of the blocks, and the composed posture of Emily, each element contributing to the tapestry of a moment that was both ordinary and profound. Richard leaned closer to Sophie, offering a gentle word of encouragement, and the child responded with a beam of pride, her eyes sparkling as she looked up at him, creating an unspoken understanding that connected them in a way that words could not fully convey. Emily returned her attention to the charts and instruments, yet her glances were frequent and attentive, a subtle acknowledgement of the significance of Richard's involvement, of the shared moments that were quietly shaping trust, recognition, and a tentative sense of family. The rhythmic sound of Sophie's laughter and the soft rustle of paper and instruments around them formed a gentle cadence, a soundtrack to the careful formation of bonds, the slow weaving of connection that was as deliberate as it was natural. Richard felt a stirring of clarity and resolve, recognizing that his engagement, attentiveness, and willingness to participate fully were the foundations of a bridge being built between past regrets, present awareness, and future possibilities. He guided Sophie's hands through another placement of blocks, observing her careful attention and subtle triumphs. And in that process, the warmth in his chest grew, a deepening understanding of the delicate balance between instruction, encouragement, and the nurturing of trust. Emily's posture remained composed, her movements fluid and purposeful, Yet the faint softening of her expression communicated the unspoken acknowledgement of the significance of this shared experience, the quiet formation of emotional bonds that had the potential to endure. Richard allowed himself to breathe slowly, taking in the filtered sunlight, the subtle interplay of gestures, the unguarded joy of the child, and the composed warmth of Emily, feeling a growing awareness that each small act of care and attention was a step toward reconciliation, recognition, and the gentle construction of a family dynamic that could thrive on presence, patience, and understanding. Sophie glanced up at Richard with a shy smile, then back to her blocks, and in that simple, unassuming action, Richard perceived the tangible beginning of a connection that had waited silently for this moment, a bridge of trust, recognition, and love that, if nurtured with careful attention and intention, could continue to grow and form the foundation of a shared future filled with possibility and hope. The sunlight had softened into a warm, golden hue as Richard Carter and Emily Johnson guided Sophie to a small corner of the room where she could continue her drawings, the space now imbued with the quiet comfort of shared attention and the gentle rhythm of presence. Richard knelt beside Sophie, his posture relaxed yet attentive, watching the way her tiny fingers moved with purpose and care, arranging colors and shapes into images that, though simple, carried an unmistakable depth of perception and a hint of imagination that reflected both her mother's attentiveness and an emerging sense of her own personality. Emily moved around the room with calm assurance, periodically glancing at the duo with a soft smile that hinted at the recognition of a moment long anticipated, the convergence of past, present, and the potential for a future carefully unfolding before them. Richard allowed himself to breathe slowly, taking in the subtle details, the glint of sunlight off the polished floor, the gentle hum of the ventilation, the rhythmic tapping of his own shoes as he shifted slightly to observe Sophie more closely. And in those details, he found a grounding that enabled him to focus fully on the quiet interactions shaping the room. Sophie turned to show him a new drawing, a small figure holding hands with two larger figures beneath a bright sun, and Richard's chest swelled with a mix of awe and a dawning sense of responsibility, realizing that this was more than play. It was a bridge being formed, a tentative yet profound connection that reached across time and circumstance. Emily guided Sophie's hands for a moment, showing her how to hold the pencil and encouraging subtle adjustments, and Richard noticed the way the child's attention shifted seamlessly between both adults, absorbing guidance and offering trust in equal measure. The sunlight highlighted the curves of the child's small hands, the careful alignment of the drawing, and the soft expressions on both Richard's and Emily's faces, creating a tableau of quiet intimacy, patience, and mutual recognition. Richard reached out to adjust a block near Sophie's drawing, and her eyes lit with a delighted sparkle, eliciting a genuine smile that spread across his face, a rare and unguarded expression of warmth and connection. Emily returned to her notes, but remained within sight, her subtle glances and the soft inflection of her voice providing reassurance and acknowledgement of the careful unfolding of trust, respect, and attentiveness between Richard and Sophie. Each small gesture, the placement of a block, the tilt of Sophie's head, the shared glance between adult and child, carried significance, weaving together the threads of recognition, awareness, and the tentative building of a familial bond that had been waiting for this precise alignment of circumstance and presence. Richard felt the weight of the moment, understanding that the simple acts of attention, patience, and deliberate engagement were forming the foundation of a connection that could endure, nurture, and grow, bridging years of separation and uncertainty with the quiet power of presence and shared experience. The room, bathed in soft afternoon light, seemed to hold its breath with them, the subtle sounds, the scratching of pencil on paper, the faint rustle of notes, the gentle sighs and soft laughter, becoming a harmonious backdrop to a slow, deliberate weaving of trust, understanding, and the potential for lasting bonds. Richard's gaze lingered on Sophie, then lifted to Emily, and in that silent exchange, he sensed the emergence of a new chapter, one that promised reconciliation, recognition, and the quiet yet profound beginnings of a family knit together by care, attentiveness, and the deliberate cultivation of connection that would extend far beyond this room, into the days, weeks, and years to come. The late afternoon light softened into a warm, amber glow that spilled across the polished floor of the examination room, bathing Richard Carter, Emily Johnson, and Sophie in a gentle radiance that seemed to mark the quiet culmination of their shared moments. Richard knelt beside Sophie, helping her place the final blocks atop a precarious tower, his hands steady and deliberate, guiding without intruding. And as the blocks stood firm, Sophie clapped her hands in delight, her laughter filling the room with a sense of accomplishment, joy, and the quiet power of connection. Emily observed, a soft smile touching her lips, her eyes reflecting both relief and subtle pride, witnessing the small yet meaningful interactions that had slowly woven the trio together, bridging years of absence, uncertainty, and unspoken history. Richard straightened, taking a measured breath, feeling the weight of clarity and purpose settle over him. The realization that these moments, simple, deliberate, and filled with presence, had laid the foundation for trust, recognition, and the gentle formation of a family dynamic that had quietly awaited this alignment of circumstance and attention. Sophie ran briefly to show a drawing she had finished, a small depiction of three figures under a bright sun, holding hands, each line imbued with care, innocence, and a remarkable sense of awareness beyond her years. Richard took the drawing carefully, studying it with a mix of pride and wonder, noting the subtle likeness in one figure that mirrored his own posture and expression, a tangible thread connecting him to the past and signaling the responsibility and possibility of the present. Emily stepped closer, her movements fluid and composed, placing a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder and exchanging a glance with Richard that conveyed understanding, recognition, and the quiet acknowledgement of shared trust and emerging family bonds. The room seemed to hold a soft, attentive energy, the filtered sunlight highlighting small gestures, the tilt of a head, the gentle guidance of a hand, the subtle warmth in an exchanged look, that collectively wove a tapestry of patience, connection, and mutual respect. Richard felt a deep sense of gratitude and resolve, realizing that presence, attentiveness, and deliberate engagement were the essential elements that would carry forward the fragile, yet promising bonds being established. Sophie's bright, unguarded laughter continued to echo softly, blending harmoniously with the subtle ambient sounds of the room, and in that rhythm, Richard sensed a new chapter unfolding, one defined not by past regrets or distance, but by awareness, care, and the deliberate cultivation of connection. Emily returned to her instruments with composed attention, yet her eyes lingered on Richard and Sophie, signaling the quiet but undeniable recognition that a family was being gently formed, anchored in trust, observation, and the careful attention paid to each other's presence. Richard allowed a moment to pause, looking from Sophie to Emily, understanding that the interplay of simple acts, encouragement, gentle guidance, shared attention, was creating the scaffolding for a lasting bond, one that could support recognition, empathy, and the promise of shared experience. The sunlight shifted once more, accentuating the soft, golden glow across the room, illuminating the quiet triumphs, the deliberate patience, and the subtle warmth that had grown between them, and Richard felt a sense of completion, a gentle satisfaction that this chapter had been navigated with care, presence, and an awareness of the power of small, intentional moments to transform the ordinary into something enduring and deeply meaningful. In that quiet, luminescent space, with Sophie leaning slightly into his side and Emily observing with composed warmth, Richard recognized that the foundation for their future together had been firmly set, a beginning marked by trust, connection, and the unspoken understanding that they were, in this moment, shaping a family knit together by attention, care, and the gentle unfolding of destiny.